the Heiress found dead at midnight a Hercule Poirot's Chapter 1, The House That Held Its Breath. The village of Ashbourne Hollow was the sort of place that appeared, at first glance, entirely harmless. Its single high street boasted a post office, a public house named the Crowned Stag Bakery, whose warm smell drifted pleasantly over the cobblestones each morning. The surrounding countryside rolled in gentle, well-mannered hills, and the sky in late October sat low and pewter grey, though the heavens themselves had decided to observe a period of respectful quiet. Thornfield Grange stood at the far end of a long gravel drive, 3/4 of a mile beyond the village boundary. It was a house that had once been beautiful in the precise, confident way that English country houses of the Georgian period tended to be. Symmetrical, pale stone, tall sash windows that caught what little light remained in the autumn afternoons. Now, however, was something about it that gave the attentive visitor pause. The ivy on the eastern wall had been permitted to grow unchecked. The topiary by the front steps had lost its disciplined shape. The whole estate seemed to be holding itself together through habit rather than care. The house belonged, or rather had for 61 years belonged, to Mrs. Constance Verriford Holt, widow of considerable fortune and considerably more opinion. She had outlived 2 husbands, a business partner, and, as she frequently reminded her assembled family, the expectations of every solicitor who had ever drawn up a will on her behalf. She was, in the words of her niece Dorothea, utterly indestructible and absolutely impossible. That weekend, the 1st of November, the household had gathered under the instruction of Mrs. Verriford Holt's solicitor, a dry-voiced man named Mr. Ambrose Creel, who had written to each family member individually with the careful phrasing of someone who has spent a lifetime delivering welcome information in polite language. The letter had said, in essence, that Mrs. Verriford Holt intended to make a final revision to her will, and that she wished all interested parties to be present at Thornfield Grange on the Friday evening, there to remain through the Sunday. The interested parties had arrived, summoned. First came Edmund Verriford, the eldest of the family, Mrs. Verriford Holt's nephew by her first marriage. He was 53, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the particular stiffness of a man who has spent decades being important in provincial business circles. His handshake was firm to the point of aggression. He arrived in a large dark motor car that he drove himself, and he spent the first 20 minutes after arriving walking through the ground floor rooms with an expression that suggested he was conducting a valuation. His wife, Miriam Verriford, arrived separately, though they were staying in the same house. She came by train and was collected by the Grange's elderly groundskeeper, Albert Sims. Miriam was 47, thin in the way that suggested discipline, rather than constitution, and she wore her dark hair pulled back with such severity that it gave her face a perpetual look of polite tension. She kissed her husband on the cheek when they met in the hall. The kiss was precise and entirely without warmth. Dorothea Sable was Mrs. Verriford Holt's niece by her second marriage, and she was, in the opinion of everyone present, genuinely fond of the old woman. She was 38, a watercolour painter of modest reputation and immodest spirit, who arrived with 2 large bags and a bottle of Burgundy. She declared she had brought as a gift, but which she opened herself that evening. She was the sort of woman who laughed easily, and who, the more observant might notice, watched everything. 4th guest was a man named Julian Faraday. He was not a family member. He was introduced, somewhat vaguely, as an old friend of the family, though Edmund's jaw had tightened perceptibly at the introduction. Julian was 42, dark eyes that moved quickly, and a way of filling silence with easy, pleasant conversation that made him simultaneously likeable and difficult to read. He had, it emerged during the first evening's dinner, served as a kind of informal financial advisor to Mrs. Veriford Holt in recent years. Edmund had not known this. Fifth resident of the Grange that weekend was Miss Phoebe Trant, the old woman's personal companion and secretary, who had lived in the house for 7 years. She was 29, unremarkable in colouring, possessed of the particular invisible competence of those who make themselves indispensable. She managed the household, managed Mrs. Veriford Holt's correspondence, and managed, apparently, the old woman's moods, which were, by all accounts, considerable. Dinner that Friday evening was served at 8. The conversation was formal and overfull, with the peculiar chattiness of people who are saying nothing of substance, because they are thinking a great deal. Mrs. Veriford Holt presided at the head of the table in a high-backed chair, dressed in black wool, with a single strand of grey pearls. She was 81 years old, entirely alert, seemed to be deriving considerable amusement from the gathering. "I am glad," she said at one point, setting down her wine-glass, with the deliberateness of someone making a statement, "that you have all come. I find that impending decisions concentrate the mind, both mine and other people's." No one replied to this. The rain began against the windows shortly after 9. The household retired at 11. Miss Phoebe Trant locked the front door and checked the downstairs windows, as was her habit. Albert Sims had a cottage on the grounds and did not sleep indoors, had long since retired. The 5 guests went to their rooms along the upper corridor. Mrs. Veriford Holt's room was at the eastern end, overlooking the garden. At 11:30, Dorothea Sable, unable to sleep, went down to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk. She noted that the hall was dark, the house quiet, and that the door to the library, which was directly beneath the old woman's bedroom, was closed but with a thin line of light showing at its base. She thought nothing of it. She returned to bed. At midnight, something heavy fell in the room above. Chapter 2. A sound in the dark. The sound brought Dorothea upright in her bed, with the immediacy that only comes when one is not, in fact, deeply asleep. It was a dull, significant thud. Not the sound of something dropped, but the sound of something fallen. There is a difference, though it is one most people cannot articulate. Dorothea Sable, who was an artist and had trained herself to pay attention, felt the distinction immediately in her chest. She lay still for 3 seconds. The house was silent again. The rain had eased to a soft sibilance against the glass. She got up. The corridor was dark. She did not turn on the electric lamp at once, standing instead at her door and listening. From the far end of the corridor near Mrs. Veriford Holt's room there was nothing. No movement, voice, no further sound. The silence was of the peculiar heavy variety that follows an event rather than precedes one. Dorothea went to the old woman's door and knocked. "Aunt Constance?" She waited, then knocked again more firmly. "Aunt Constance, are you all right?" No answer. She tried the handle. The door opened. The room was lit by the bedside lamp, which cast a warm and domestic glow entirely at odds with what Dorothea saw when she entered. Mrs. Constance Veriford Holt lay on the floor, beside the bed, one hand flung outward, the other folded beneath her. The small table by the bed had been overturned. A glass of water had shattered on the wooden floor, and the water was spreading in a slow, different pool. The old woman's eyes were half open. She was not breathing. Dorothea stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, to no one at all, "Oh, Aunt Constance." She did not scream. She was not the kind of woman who screamed. She turned and went directly to Edmund's room, 3 doors down, and hammered until he opened it, bleary-eyed and formidable, in his dressing gown. She told him what she had found in 4 words. Edmund went to look. Then Edmund went to Julian Faraday's room, a fact Dorothea noted, rather than to Miss Trant's. By 20 past midnight, all 5 household members stood in or near the doorway of Mrs. Veriford Holt's bedroom. No one had touched the body. Julian Faraday had thought to check for a pulse. There was none. Edmund had tried and failed to reach the village constable by telephone. The line was behaving badly in the rain, as it often did. It was Julian who eventually got through at approximately 12:30 and spoke to Sergeant Elford in a clear, calm voice that contained precisely the correct amount of controlled distress. Sergeant Elford arrived at Thornfield Grange at 1:15 in the morning. He was a competent man of 50 who had dealt with sudden deaths before, not, in his professional opinion, enough of them to be complacent. He surveyed the room, asked preliminary questions, requested that everyone refrain from leaving the property until the situation had been properly assessed. He used the word assessed with the careful precision of a man who had not yet decided which other word to use. The county physician, Dr. Orwell Marsh, arrived at 2:30. He was brief in his examination, thorough in his notes, and careful in his language. He said that the cause of death was not immediately apparent from external examination. He said that Mrs. Veriford Holt was a woman of advanced age with a history of cardiac irregularity. He also said, and here he lowered his voice, speaking only to Sergeant Elford, that the position of the body was inconsistent with a simple fall. The angle of the upper torso, combined with the undisturbed bedclothes, suggested that she had not risen from the bed and fallen. She had been standing, or had been moved, had then gone down. Dr. Marsh requested a full post-mortem examination. In the sitting room, the 5 household members waited in the particular purgatory of the newly bereaved and the genuinely uncertain. Edmund sat in the wing-backed chair by the fireplace, his hands folded, his face carefully composed. Miriam sat beside him and did not look at him. Julian Faraday stood near the window, watching the rain-darkened grounds with his hands in his dressing-gown pockets. Miss Trant sat on the settee with a cup of tea she had made, without asking anyone, and had not yet drunk. Dorothea stood in the middle of the room, and, from time to time, looked at each of the others in turn. At 4 in the morning, Sergeant Elford came to the sitting room and told them that the County Criminal Investigation Department had been contacted. Pending the post-mortem report, the death was being treated as suspicious. He asked them, politely but with the immovable quality of someone who is not actually making a request to remain in the house. Edmund said, "This is outrageous." Miriam said, "Edmund." Julian said nothing and went to make more tea. Miss Trant looked at the untouched cup in her hands and began, very quietly, to cry. It was Dorothea who, in the pale grey of the early morning, said what no one else had said aloud. "Someone in this house killed her. That's what they think, isn't it?" It was not a question. Sergeant Elford, to his credit, did not deny it. Outside, the dawn came in, cold and colourless, over the hills of Ashbourne Hollow. Thornfield Grange stood in it, like a house that had finally exhaled the breath it had been holding all along. Chapter 3. The Neat Little Man. From London, it was on the Sunday morning, some 36 hours after the discovery of the body, that Hercule Poirot arrived at Thornfield Grange. He came in a hired motor car, having taken the early train from London to the nearest station, and then engaged the services of a local driver whose principal qualification appeared to be a willingness to navigate the Hollow's smaller roads without complaint. Poirot sat in the back, with his black coat buttoned to the top, and his small gloved hands folded precisely in his lap. He watched the countryside pass, with the expression of a man who finds the English autumn moderately interesting and considerably damp. The circumstances of his involvement were, as was occasionally the case, somewhat indirect. It had been Dorothea Sable who had written to him, or, rather, who had caused the letter to be written by a cousin in London, who maintained a minor but useful connection to the circles in which Poirot occasionally moved, had described the situation at Thornfield Grange with admirable concision. A suspicious death, a house full of suspects, and a local constabulary that was proceeding with diligence, but, in Dorothea's view, without sufficient imagination. Poirot had found the letter interesting. He had also, if he were honest with himself, and Poirot was, as a rule, extremely honest with himself, found the phrase without sufficient imagination rather appealing. He had come. Sergeant Elford had been forewarned by the time the motor car turned up the gravel drive. He greeted Poirot at the front steps with the manner of a man who has heard of Hercule Poirot, and is not entirely certain whether to be reassured or offended by his presence. He shook hands, said that the investigation was proceeding satisfactorily, added, with a slight tightening about the eyes, that any assistance would naturally be welcomed. "Naturally," said Poirot pleasantly, and removed his hat and gloves with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who intends to be in a place for some time. Post-mortem report had arrived that morning. It confirmed what Dr. Marsh had suspected. Mrs. Constance Veriford Holt had died of cardiac arrest. She had, however, been administered a substance, specifically a significant quantity of digoxin, that had almost certainly induced that arrest. Digoxin, the sergeant explained with the care of a man reading from notes he does not wish to misquote, cardiac glycoside commonly prescribed for heart conditions. In therapeutic doses it is a medicine, sire. In excess, it disrupts the heart's electrical system with considerable effectiveness. "And was the late Madame Veriford Holt prescribed digoxin?" asked Poirot. "She was not." "Oh, excellent," said Poirot, in the tone of a man to whom excellent means this confirms what I had already supposed. "And the method of administration?" "Dissolved in the water glass by the bedside, most likely. The glass was broken in the fall. Traces were recovered from the fragments." Poirot nodded. He asked to see the room. He was shown upstairs by Sergeant Elford, watched him carefully, as though expecting some form of theatrical performance. What he got was a great deal of stillness. Poirot stood in the doorway of Mrs. Veriford Holt's bedroom, and looked at the room for a full 3 minutes without entering it. He looked at the position of the overturned table. He looked at the window, closed but unlocked. He looked at the small writing desk in the corner, and at the orderly arrangement of bottles and boxes on the dressing table. He looked at the bedside cabinet, which still held its lamp, pair of reading glasses, and a small leather-bound notebook. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the notebook. "We've had a look," said Sergeant Elford. "Appointments, mostly. A few personal notes. Nothing obvious." Poirot opened it with his gloved hand, turned into the pages with the delicacy of a man handling evidence rather than a diary. He paused at one entry, read it twice, and closed the book. He said nothing. Sergeant Elford noted, however, that the little Belgian's right eyebrow had risen approximately 2 millimeters. They went downstairs. Poirot asked to be introduced to the household. Edmund Veriford received him in the library with barely concealed impatience, which Poirot found illuminating. Men of Edmund's sort were impatient with precise, measured men as a rule. They found precision unsettling. Edmund said that he had told everything to Sergeant Elford already, and did not see what more could be added. Poirot said that he had no doubt of it, and asked a single question. Had Edmund been surprised, when he arrived Friday, to find Julian Faraday in the house? Edmund paused fractionally before answering. "Somewhat," he said, "and yet you went to Mr. Faraday's room first, the night of the death. Before me, Trant, before anyone else." Edmund's expression did not change. He seemed the most likely to keep a level head. Poirot smiled politely and moved on. He met Miriam Veriford in the morning room, where she was sitting with her hands in her lap, and a book she was not reading open on the table beside her. She was precise in her answers, calm to the point of flatness, and watched Poirot with intelligent grey eyes that gave nothing away. He thought her interesting. Julian Faraday he found in the garden, despite the cold, walking the gravel path between the bare rose beds with his hands in his coat pockets, turned when Poirot approached and smiled out with the easy good humour of a man who is either entirely unconcerned or extremely skilled at appearing so. He said that he was happy to help in any way possible, and that the whole dreadful business had shocked him profoundly. Phoebe Trant met him in the hallway where she had been polishing the banister rail with focused energy that had the quality of someone keeping themselves occupied. She was quiet, precise in her answers, and very careful not to say anything about anyone in particular, a quality that Poirot noted with great interest, because it requires a conscious effort. Dorothea Sable, who had invited him, poured him coffee in the kitchen, and looked at him with the frank directness of a woman who has been thinking hard for 36 hours. "Well?" she said. "Well," agreed Poirot, warming his hands around the cup. "We shall see." Chapter 4. Questions like small, sharp instruments. Poirot had a method of conducting interviews that was, on the surface, entirely conversational. He asked questions that seemed tangential, listened to answers that seemed unrelated, returned, often much later, to a point so small that the interviewee had entirely forgotten it was a point at all. It was, he had once explained to Hastings, rather like finding a loose thread in a very well-made garment. One did not pull the thread immediately. One noted where it was. On the Sunday afternoon, he asked to speak with each member of the household individually. Sergeant Elford arranged this with the slightly resigned cooperation of a man who has decided to trust a process he does not entirely understand. Poirot used the library, a room that smelled of old leather and the particular kind of dust that accumulates on books that are owned but not read. He sat in the chair behind the desk and placed his small notebook in front of him, open to a blank page, on which he wrote, during the course of the afternoon, remarkably little. Edmund Veriford came first, at his own insistence. He repeated, with precision, his account of the evening. He had retired at 11, had been woken by Dorothea's knocking at approximately 12:15, had gone to inspect his aunt's room, and had immediately summoned Julian Faraday. He had not, he said firmly, entered the bedroom beyond the doorway. He had seen enough. "You and Mrs. Veriford Holt," said Poirot pleasantly, "were close." Edmund said that they were family. "That is not," Poirot observed, "quite the same thing." A very brief silence. "We had our differences, as families do. And the matter of the will, were you expecting to be principal beneficiary?" "I had no expectations whatsoever," said Edmund. "Ah," said Poirot, "and yet you arrived with some urgency when summoned, driving yourself, rather than taking the train, as one might, when time feels pressing." He paused. "Tell me, did your aunt ever speak to you about Mr. Faraday's involvement in her financial affairs?" Edmund's jaw tightened. "She did not. I learned of it when I arrived. And you were not pleased." "I was surprised." Poirot let the distinction lie. Miriam Veriford sat with the same composed stillness she had shown earlier. She confirmed her husband's account with careful consistency. So careful, Poirot noted, that it had the quality of a story rehearsed rather than recalled. She said that she had gone directly to her room after dinner, taken a sleeping draught, as was her habit when travelling, and had not woken until Edmund came to her door. A sleeping draught, Poirot thoughtfully. Prescribed? Of course. And do you carry it always when you travel? Yes. A fractional hesitation. It is a mild preparation, entirely routine. Poirot wrote a single word in his notebook. She could not see it from where she sat. Julian Faraday was expansive and cooperative, and volunteered considerably more information than was strictly required of him. Poirot found interesting in its own way. He had known Mrs. Verriford Holt for 4 years, having been introduced through a mutual acquaintance in London. He had indeed assisted her with certain investment decisions. He described himself a financial consultant, independent, and she had been, he said warmly, a remarkable woman. He had arrived at the Grange on Thursday evening, day before the other guests, at her personal invitation. He had dined with her alone that evening. This fact had not previously been mentioned by anyone. "Just the two of you," said Poirot. "And Miss Trant, who served and then retired. And the conversation?" "Over dinner on Thursday evening." Faraday smiled. "She was in excellent spirits. She spoke about the family, with affection and some exasperation, as was her way. She mentioned that the will revision was going to surprise people." He paused. "She seemed pleased about that." "Pleased," repeated Poirot. "Yes, I imagine she was. Phoebe Trant sat very straight, and answered questions. In short, complete sentences with the diligence of a person giving evidence. She had retired at 10:30 on Friday. She had heard nothing unusual in the night until the commotion in the corridor after midnight. She had never, to her knowledge, seen any medication belonging to other guests. She had prepared Mrs. Verriford Holt's usual evening glass of water, as she did every night, and had placed it on the bedside table at approximately 10 o'clock. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "Prepared it at 10, he said. "And Mrs. Verriford Holt died at midnight, a 2-hour window." Miss Trant said nothing. "The water glass was broken when the body was found. However, the bedside cabinet also held reading glasses and a leather notebook." He paused. Had Mrs. Verriford Holt been reading recently? Was she in the habit of reading before sleep? "Yes," said Miss Trant, "every night." "And was the notebook always by the bed?" A pause. "Not always. She used it for private notes. She sometimes kept it in the desk drawer, but on Friday night it was by the bed." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, Miss Trant. That is most useful." Miss Trant left. Poirot sat alone for a few minutes, looking at the single word in his notebook. Then he wrote 3 more words beneath it, underlined them, turned the page. Dorothea Sable, when her turn came, did not wait to be asked questions. She sat down, poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the desk, and said, "I want to tell you what I think, and then you can ask me what you like." "Please," said Poirot, with the warmth of a man who has found, unexpectedly, exactly the interlocutor he needed. "Julian Faraday is not what he says he is," she said. "I think Edmund knew something terrible about Aunt Constance's finances before he arrived, not after. And I think Phoebe Trant knows considerably more than she's saying, and she's protecting someone. I'm just not certain who." Poirot looked at her. "And Miriam?" "Miriam," said Dorothea, "has not once cried, not once. She is very good at being composed. She has been afraid." She paused. "There is a difference, isn't there, between choosing not to show grief and being afraid?" "There is," Poirot quietly. "A very precise difference. You are very observant, Mademoiselle Sable." "I'm a painter," said Dorothea. "It's the same thing." Chapter 5. The obvious man. The most obvious suspect, as far as Sergeant Elford was concerned, was Julian Faraday. The reasoning was not illogical. Here was a man with no blood tie to the deceased, who had positioned himself in a position of financial trust and influence over an elderly woman of considerable wealth. He had arrived a day before the other guests, and had dined with her privately the night before her death. He had, it emerged upon further inquiry, no registered business address for his consulting practice. His name did not appear in any professional registry that Sergeant Elford could locate. He had been charm itself since the body was discovered, helpful and calm and cooperative. Sergeant Elford found the cooperativeness, in particular, suspicious. Guilty men often cooperated strenuously. There was also the matter of what Inspector Graves, who had arrived from the county station on the Sunday afternoon, referred to as the will question. The existing will of Mrs. Constance Veriford Holt, drawn up 18 months prior, and on file with Mr. Creel, left the Thornfield Grange estate and the bulk of the financial holdings to Edmund, Veriford, with smaller but significant bequests to Dorothea Sable and Phoebe Trant. Julian Faraday received nothing, Mr. Confirmed that he had received written instructions from Mrs. Veriford Holt to draw up a revised version. He had not yet done so. The revision, he said carefully, was to have been executed on the Monday following the gathering. Contents of the proposed revision were in a sealed instruction, he said. He would open it, as was protocol, when required. Sergeant Elford requested that he open it immediately. Mr. Creel declined, citing professional obligation, but agreed to produce it upon receipt of appropriate legal authority, which Inspector Graves said he would obtain by morning. In the meantime, the investigation sharpened around Julian Faraday. Where had he obtained the digoxin, tablet or powder form, would need to have been brought to the Grange. Nobody had a prescription for it. The local pharmacy in Ashbourne Hollow confirmed they had not dispensed it recently to any of the named parties. A broader inquiry was made. Poirot observed all of this with the polite attention of a man watching a play he has seen in a previous production. He said very little to Inspector Graves, who was perfectly adequate and perfectly conventional, and he walked the house instead. The corridors, the kitchen, the library, the garden, with his hands behind his back, and his eyes performing their quiet, comprehensive cataloguing, he found 3 things of interest during these perambulations, none of which he shared immediately with the police. The first was in the kitchen bin, beneath the evening's vegetable peelings, a small, empty foil medication blister pack. It was of the sort used for prescription tablets. It had been torn in half, presumably to make it less identifiable, but the 2 halves were both present. Poirot wrapped them in his handkerchief and placed them in his pocket. The second was in the garden, beside the stone bench at the eastern end of the Rose Walk, a cigarette stub, quants. This was interesting because none of the household members smoked, or rather, none of them had mentioned smoking, and no cigarettes had been seen. Albert Sims, the groundskeeper, did smoke, but he smoked a pipe. This was a cigarette of a particular kind, slim, pale, of the sort more often purchased on the continent than in rural England. The third was the most interesting of all, and it was not a physical object. It was an absence. In Mrs. Veriford Holt's bedroom, restored now to something approximating order, broken glass removed and the table righted, Poirot noted that the leather notebook from the bedside table was gone. He asked Sergeant Elford about it. The sergeant confirmed that it had been logged as evidence and taken in with the other materials from the room. "I would very much like to look at it again," said Poirot. The sergeant, with some reluctance, produced it. Poirot turned to the final written entry, dated the Thursday before the death. It contained 3 lines. The first 2 were an appointment. Dentist, Monday 10 a.m. crossed through and rescheduled. The third line was not an appointment. It was written in a slightly different ink, more deliberately. The old woman had chosen her words. It read, JF confirmed. E will not like it. File with Creel. N. Burn the letters. Poirot read it 4 times. Then he handed the notebook back. The letters, he said to himself softly. He went back to the library and sat for 20 minutes with his eyes half closed and his fingertips together. Then he went looking for Phoebe Trant. He found her in the small room off the kitchen that served as her office. A neat, ordered space with labelled files and a carefully arranged desk. She was again occupied with some task that he suspected was displacement rather than urgency. Miss Trant, he said from the doorway, the letters that Mrs. Veriford Holt asked you to burn. Did you burn them? She went very still. Then she looked at him with eyes that were at once frightened, and, beneath the fear, relieved in the way that people are relieved when a secret they have been carrying alone is finally found by someone else. Not yet, she said. She asked me on Friday evening. Before dinner. I meant to do it after the guests left on Sunday. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to do. You have them still? She opened the second drawer of her desk. Beneath a manila folder, there were 6 envelopes, unopened, bundled with a rubber band. She placed them on the desk. Poirot looked at the handwriting on the topmost envelope and felt something clarify in his mind like a liquid settling. Thank you, Miss Trant, he said. You have done entirely the right thing. Chapter 6. What the gardener saw Albert Sims had been the groundskeeper at Thornfield Grange for 22 years. He was 71, lean and weathered in the manner of men who have spent their working lives outdoors, regardless of season. He had the quality, common in people who work alone and observe much, of knowing a great deal while appearing to know very little. He spoke slowly, chose his words with the care of a man for whom speech was a tool rather than a pleasure, and met Poirot's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who has decided to trust. Poirot found him on the Monday morning in the kitchen garden, turning the soil with methodical strokes of a spade that were more meditative than agricultural. "Mr. Sims?" said Poirot, standing at the garden gate. "Wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes." Albert Sims set down the spade without hurry. He produced his pipe from his coat pocket, filled and lit it with the unhurried ritual of the long-practised, and sat on the edge of the raised bed. "Thought you'd come," he said. "Been watching you walk the grounds." "I like gardens," said Poirot. "One learns much from what is tended and what is allowed to grow wild." "The rose walk's been let go since Mr. Holt died," said Albert. "She didn't like it touched, said it was his." "And the stone bench? Did she use it?" "Sometimes. Not lately. Too cold. Though," he paused, drew on his pipe, "someone was there Thursday night." Poirot's expression did not change. "I was in my cottage, gone midnight. Couldn't sleep, never do well when the weather's changing. I looked out the window." He nodded toward the garden. "There's a line of sight from my window to the stone bench, past the kitchen garden hedge. Someone was sitting there. Just the once. I saw the light of a cigarette." "A cigarette," said Poirot. "You are certain it was not a pipe?" "A pipe glows different," said Albert, with the quiet authority of expertise. "Small and close-drawn like a coal. This was the long draw of a cigarette. Someone sitting and smoking and thinking in the dark." "Could you see who?" "Too far off. The moon was behind cloud. Couldn't say if it was a man or a woman." Poirot nodded. "And what time, as precisely as you can recall?" Albert considered. "1:45, perhaps. 12:30 at the latest." Before then, or simultaneous with the discovery of the body inside?" Albert looked at him steadily. "Was someone killed?" "Yes," said Poirot simply. "Mrs. Veriford Holt was murdered." Albert Sims took the pipe from his mouth, looked at it, put it back. He said nothing for a moment then. She was a difficult woman to work for. Particular about everything. Didn't like things moved or changed. He paused. I've been here 22 years. Nobody's ever gone near the Rose Walk bench except her. Pfft, nobody until Thursday night, said Poirot. Aye. Poirot walked back toward the house in a thoughtful mood. The stone bench was at the eastern end of the garden, directly beneath the eastern wall, the wall that bore the overgrown ivy, the wall along which Poirot had already noted. The growth was thick enough, and the window ledge low enough to provide, for someone reasonably agile, means of reaching the first floor. He went back to the wall and examined the ivy with care. It had not been disturbed in any obvious way. No broken stems, no fresh scratches on the stone. But at the corner, where the wall met the garden boundary, a strand of dark fabric was caught on a nail. A thin thread, dark wool, navy or black. Poirot freed it very carefully and added it to the contents of his pocket, which were growing informative. The sealed instruction from Mr. Creel arrived that morning, unlocked by the legal authority Inspector Graves had obtained. Poirot was present when it was opened, having positioned himself, with considerable tact, as an unofficial but recognised presence in the investigation. The revised will of Mrs. Constance Veriford Holt contained several changes of note. The bequest to Edmund Veriford had been reduced from the entirety of the estate to 1/3. The bequest to Dorothea had been doubled. Phoebe Trant had been left a comfortable annuity and the tenancy of the gardener's cottage for life. Julian Faraday had been left the remaining third of the estate. Nearly £200,000 and a portfolio of investments. Edmund Veriford, reading the document over Inspector Graves's shoulder, said, "That is insane." Inspector Graves looked at him carefully. "She was manipulated," said Edmund. "That man had worked on her for years. This is exactly the kind of—" "The kind of what?" said Poirot pleasantly. Edmund stopped. He looked at Poirot for the first time as though he had only just registered his presence. "The kind of undue influence," he said, each word separate and cold, "that invalidates a testamentary document." "Possibly," said Poirot. "If the document had been executed, fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, it was not." He looked at the revised will. "The existing will stands, which means, Monsieur Veriford, that you remain the principal heir." Edmund said nothing. The silence lasted several seconds, and Poirot, who was watching Edmund's face with great attention, thought, "Yes, he knows that. He has always known that. He is deciding how much of that knowledge to show." It was, he reflected, turning away, rather illuminating. Chapter 7. Things People Keep. The 6 letters from the drawer of Phoebe Trant's desk were, as Poirot had suspected from the handwriting, addressed to Mrs. Veriford Holt, and written by Edmund Veriford over the course of the previous 18 months. They had not been opened, or rather, they had been opened, read, and resealed with the careful hand of someone who understood that the physical integrity of correspondence is a kind of evidence. Their contents, which Poirot read with the same methodical attention he gave everything, told a story that was both banal and illuminating. Edmund had been writing to his aunt on the subject of money. Not begging. Edmund was not the sort of man who begged, but applying sustained, reasoned, increasingly insistent pressure. He had, it emerged from the sequence of letters, made a series of poor investments on the basis of what he described in the first letter as inside information provided through a professional contact. He had lost a great deal of money. He needed the estate, needed the certainty of its inheritance as collateral against a debt that was becoming urgent. The professional contact who had provided the information Poirot noted, was not named in any of the 6 letters. Edmund referred to him only as the consultant. But the timing, the coincidence of Edmund's financial difficulties with the arrival of Julian, Faraday in Mrs. Veriford Holt's circle, was interesting, very interesting indeed. In the 5th letter, written 3 months before the events at Thornfield Grange, Edmund's tone changed. The earlier letters had been careful, controlled. This one was different. He wrote that he had evidence, the word was underlined, that certain parties advising his aunt were not acting in her interest, and that if she did not agree to formalise his position as principal beneficiary, he would be obliged to make this evidence available to the appropriate authorities. A threat, elegantly phrased, but a threat nonetheless. Mrs. Veriford Holt had, apparently, not been intimidated. Poirot placed the letters in a folder and went in search of Julian Faraday. He found him in the drawing-room, reading a newspaper with the air of a man who has decided that appearing unconcerned is his best available strategy. He looked up when Poirot entered. "Another conversation," said Faraday. His tone was light. "If you will permit it." Poirot sat. "Mr. Faraday, let me speak plainly for a moment. I find it refreshing. By all means. The investment scheme through which Edmund Veriford lost a considerable sum of money. Were you involved in it?" Pause was fractional but present. "That is quite a question. It is the question I am asking." Faraday put down the newspaper. He looked at Poirot without the easy smile and said, "I introduced Edmund to a financial opportunity about 2 years ago, believed at the time that it was sound. It proved not to be. I was as surprised as anyone. And yet you chose not to mention this prior connection with Edmund when speaking to the police. It seemed irrelevant." "Nothing," Poirot gently, "is irrelevant, particularly the things that people choose not to mention." He paused. "Did Mrs. Veriford Holt know of this connection between you and her nephew?" "She was aware that I knew Edmund. We had mutual acquaintance. That is not what I asked." Another pause, longer this time. "She may have, in recent months, come to understand the fuller picture." "Ah," said Poirot. "And is it possible, do you think, that the will revision, the one leaving you a considerable portion of the estate, was connected to that understanding? That she was, perhaps, redirecting wealth in a way that complicated Edmund's plans, rather than rewarding your counsel?" Faraday looked at him steadily. "You're suggesting she used me as an instrument?" "I am suggesting that Madame Veriford Holt was an extremely intelligent woman who enjoyed making things complicated for people who had disappointed her." Poirot smiled. "And I think you have wondered the same thing." For the first time, Julian Faraday appeared genuinely unsettled. He looked away. "She was not," he said quietly, "what I expected when I first came here." "No," said Poirot, "I suspect she rarely was." He spoke to Miriam Veriford that afternoon in the morning room again, and this time the formality between them had a different quality. Poirot had been thinking about Dorothea's observation. She has been afraid, and he thought he understood now what the fear was. It was not the fear of discovery. It was the fear of her husband. "Mrs. Veriford," he said, "you told me you took a sleeping draught on Friday night. Were you perhaps also awake at some point during the night, before the commotion? She looked at him, the composure held but only just. "I may have woken briefly. The rain. Did you hear anyone in the corridor?" The composure cracked, not dramatically, but visibly, like a fine line appearing in plaster. "I don't wish to." "I am not asking you to condemn anyone," said Poirot, very gently. "I am asking you what you heard. Because, Madame Veriford, the truth has a way of arriving eventually. The only question is whether it arrives with your help or without it." She was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "I heard a door, in the corridor, quietly, at about 11:45. One door? Two, very close together. The second, I thought, was further along, toward the east end. Toward the east end. Toward Mrs. Veriford Holt's room. And your husband, said Poirot. Was he in bed beside you at that time? Miriam Veriford looked out the window at the grey November garden. He was not, she said, in the voice of someone setting down something very heavy. Chapter 8. The Weight of Old Silences. By Tuesday morning, the atmosphere at Thornfield Grange had undergone a change of quality. The formal, watchful politeness of the early days had given way to something rawer and less composed. People avoided each other in corridors. Meals, if they were taken at all, were brief and largely silent. Edmund had retreated entirely to the library, and could be heard, occasionally, in low and urgent conversation on the telephone. With his solicitor, presumably, though he said nothing of this to anyone. Poirot spent the morning in his room, thinking. This was, to him, the essential part of any investigation, not the gathering of clues, which was largely mechanical, but the ordering of what had been gathered. That he sat in the armchair by the window, with his eyes half closed, and his mind arranging and rearranging the pieces with the patient precision of a jeweller sorting gems, each one held to the light, turned, assessed, placed in relation to the others. By 11 o'clock he had a picture. It was not yet complete. There were two pieces still uncertain, occupying positions in the arrangement that he was not fully confident of. But the outlines were clear enough. He went downstairs and asked to see Dorothea Sable. She came to the library wearing her coat, having been, she said, sitting in the garden. He noted that she had been crying, not recently, but in the recent past. Her eyes were slightly reddened. She sat down and looked at him directly, as was her way. "I want to ask you about a specific thing," said Poirot. "The library, you said, when you went to the kitchen for milk, that the library door was closed, but with a light showing beneath it. What time was that? Just before midnight?" "Perhaps 5 to. And when you came back up, perhaps 8 or 10 minutes later, was the light still there?" Dorothea thought carefully. I don't think so. I didn't look deliberately, but I think it was dark. So between 10 to midnight and midnight, the library was in use and then was vacated." He paused. "The library is directly beneath Mrs. Veriford Holt's room, and the library has a window that opens to the eastern side of the house." Dorothea looked at him. "The ivy wall?" "Yes," she said. "Could someone have gone up that way? The ivy is thick enough. And the window on the upper floor, Mrs. Veriford Holt's window, was unlocked. It is not usually unlocked in November. Miss Trant confirms that she does not recall leaving it unlocked." He paused. "She also confirms that the bedroom window was of the sort that can be opened from the outside with the correct implement, if it is already unlatched." Dorothea's face had gone very still. Someone came in through the window. Someone who had access to the library to reach the wall, and who knew the window was unlatched. He folded his hands. "Who uses the library regularly, Mademoiselle Sable?" "Edmund," she said immediately. "Edmund lives in there. Always has when he visits. He keeps his papers there." She stopped then. "And Phoebe prepares the room for him each time. She knows every inch of it." "Yes," Poirot quietly. "She does." He found Phoebe Trant in the kitchen, preparing a lunch that nobody would eat. She had the focused, contained quality of someone maintaining function under considerable internal pressure. Poirot came in and sat at the kitchen table without preamble. She paused in her work and turned to face him. "Miss Trant," he said, "put, I believe you know a great deal more than you have told me. I also believe that you have been protecting someone, and I believe that person has not been entirely honest with you about the degree to which you are being asked to carry a very considerable burden." She said nothing for a moment. Then, I don't know what you mean. I think you do. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Veriford Holt trusted you. She left you her letters, her private notebook, the management of her household. She trusted you with the knowledge of the will revision, and I believe she trusted you, on the evening before her death, with something else. A concern she had, perhaps, about someone in the house. Phoebe Trant's hands tightened on the edge of the counter. She said something to you on Friday evening, said Poirot. Before dinner. What was it? Very long silence. The kitchen clock ticked. She said, said Phoebe Trant at last, her voice barely audible, that she thought one of her guests intended to do something foolish. She said she wasn't afraid, but she wanted me to know. Her voice caught. She told me to keep the library window closed. I forgot. The final words fell into the silence like a stone into water. It is not your fault, Poirot, and the gentleness with which he said it was entirely genuine. The fault belongs to whoever performed the act, not to you. Phoebe Trant turned to the window. Her shoulders were very still for a long moment. Then, she knew, didn't she? She knew what someone planned to do, and she let them come anyway. I believe, said Poirot slowly, that she did believe she had a very precise and very deliberate reason for doing so. But the person who acted on their plan, Miss Trant, that person chose to act. Whatever was known or suspected in advance does not absolve them of that choice. He left her in the kitchen and went for a short walk in the cold November garden, hands behind his back, thinking about the old woman who had held her dangerous dinner party, and known, perhaps, exactly what she was inviting. Chapter 9. The Arrangement of the Players. On Tuesday afternoon, Poirot asked Sergeant Elford and Inspector Graves to arrange for all 5 household members to be present in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock. He made this request quietly and without drama, in the manner of a man who is asking for something he expects to receive. Inspector Graves had by now developed a cautious respect for the small Belgian's methods, complied. The drawing-room at Thornfield Grange was a large, well-proportioned room with high plaster ceilings and long windows overlooking the garden. Fire had been lit. The afternoon was cold, and its light moved pleasantly over the pale walls. The 5 guests assembled as requested, taking seats with the self-conscious arrangement of people who are aware that where they sit may be observed. Edmund chose the sofa near the fireplace, Miriam beside him at a precise distance. Julian Faraday took an armchair near the window. Dorothea stood for a moment, then settled in a window seat. Miss Trant sat on a straight-backed chair near the door. Poirot stood near the fireplace. He had, Dorothea noticed, changed his cuffs. A small thing, but she found it somehow significant, the sense of a man who had prepared himself. Inspector Graves and Sergeant Elford stood near the door, present but peripheral, as Poirot had arranged. "Thank you," said Poirot, "for coming. I know that these last days have been extremely difficult, and I appreciate your patience." Edmund said, "I assume this is the point at which you explain yourself." "It is the point," said Poirot pleasantly, "at which the truth explains itself. I am merely the channel," he began. Mrs. Constance Veriford Holt was murdered on the night of Friday, the 1st of November, between 11:45 and midnight. The method was digoxin, dissolved in her bedside water-glass. The digoxin was introduced into the glass after Miss Trant placed it there at 10 o'clock. So between 10 o'clock and midnight, someone entered the bedroom and added the substance. He paused. The question, you understand, is not what happened. Post-mortem established that clearly. The question is who did it, and how, and, most importantly, why. No one spoke. "Let us begin," said Poirot. "With motive, because a motive illuminates everything else." Mrs. Veriford Holt was about to revise her will. She had summoned her family. specifically those who expected to benefit. For this announcement, we now know the terms of that revision: reduced bequest to Edmund Veriford, an increased bequest to Dorothea Sable, and a substantial new bequest to Julian Faraday. He turned to Edmund. For you, this represented a significant financial disaster. You had already lost a substantial sum through an investment scheme in which, I should note, Mr. Faraday played a role, though his responsibility in that matter is a separate question. You had written to your aunt demanding the security of your inheritance. She had not complied. The will revision was, from your perspective, catastrophic. Edmund's face was very controlled. This is speculation. It is inference from evidence, said Poirot calmly. The 6 letters in your handwriting, which you asked your aunt to destroy, constitute, I think, something other than speculation. He turned slightly. The question of motive is therefore straightforward, but motive alone is never sufficient. There must also be opportunity, means. He described in clear and precise sequence what had happened that Friday night. The library light that Dorothea had seen, Edmund in the library, having retrieved the digoxin, crushed from tablets, dissolved in a small bottle of water, from wherever he had kept it. The library window, open to the ivy wall, the climbing of the wall, with the assistance of the ivy's thick growth. The unlatched bedroom window, known to be unlatched, because Edmund had spent years visiting this house, and knew its peculiarities, and because he had, at some point that day, ensured that it was unlatched. The brief and silent entry into the room. The old woman, perhaps already asleep, or perhaps, knowing what was intended, choosing not to resist. The doctored water left by the bed, the return through the window, the sound that Mademoiselle Sable heard at midnight, said Poirot, was not Mrs. Veriford Holt falling from natural causes. It was Mrs. Veriford Holt, who had perhaps drunk only a portion of the glass, and then rose, realizing what was happening, fell as the cardiac effect took hold. He paused. She was conscious of what was occurring. The notebook entry, JF confirmed, E. Will not like it. Burn the letters, was written that Thursday evening. She knew, I believe, that the letters were dangerous. She also knew that her nephew was desperate. Miriam Veriford said very quietly, He was in the corridor. Edmund turned to her slowly. At 11:45, said Miriam, without looking at her husband. He was in the corridor. I heard his door. I heard him go. Miriam, I told Monsieur Poirot yesterday, she said. Her voice was very steady. I am sorry, Edmund. I am not sorry. The room was very still. Edmund Veriford sat for a moment longer in the wing-back chair by the fireplace, his hands on the armrests, his face doing something complicated and private. Then he said, not to Poirot, not to the room, but to some internal audience. She was going to give it away. 40 years of family, and she was going to give it away. She was going to distribute it, said Poirot, as was her right. Edmund said nothing more. Inspector Graves moved forward. Sergeant Elford was already at the door. Chapter 10. Full accounting. The arrest of Edmund Veriford was, as such things go, quiet. He did not protest. He stood when he was addressed, answered the formal caution in a single clear affirmative, and left the room without speaking to his wife. At the door, paused and looked back at the drawing-room. Not at Miriam, not at Poirot, but at the room itself, pale walls, and the firelight, and the windows overlooking the garden. It was the look of a man taking leave of something. The door closed. The remaining 4 people in the room sat in a silence that had, now that the primary tension had resolved, kind of hollow quality, the silence after a long expected event, when the shape of the waiting is suddenly absent, and one does not know quite what to do with the space. It was Dorothea who spoke first. How long have you known? I began to have a clear picture yesterday morning, said Poirot. He sat down, which he had not been his account, and accepted the tea that Miss Trant, responding to some instinct, had got up to make. Physical evidence was consistent from the beginning. The thread on the ivy wall, dark navy wool, matching the dressing gown Edmund was wearing. The cigarette by the bench was a distraction. I believe Julian left that before midnight, when he was walking the grounds because he could not sleep. He looked at Faraday. You knew that something was likely to happen that night, did you not? Faraday looked at him steadily. She told me, he said, on Thursday at dinner. She told me that Edmund had been threatening her, and that she was cautious about the weekend. She said she had taken precautions. He paused. I didn't know what form the threat might take. I went out to walk because I found I couldn't sit still. You might have told the police. She asked me not to. She was very specific about that. He looked at his hands. She said she wanted to see what he would do. I think she had made up her mind about something, and she wanted confirmation. She wanted, said Poirot quietly, to be right. He had thought a great deal about this in his morning's contemplation. Constance Verford-Holt had been an intelligent woman who had spent 60 years being precise about things. She had spent years watching Edmund's growing greed with the cool eye of someone who keeps records. She had known about the investment scheme. She had suspected, and then known, that Edmund was capable of something beyond mere grasping. She had revised her will, not entirely because of Julian's financial advice, but as a provocation, as a test. It was not, Poirot reflected, the wisest course she might have chosen, but he suspected that wisdom, in the strict sense, had not been her primary motivation. She had wanted the truth established. She had wanted Edmund's character confirmed, incontrovertibly, by his own actions. She had placed herself in the way of considerable danger in order to be correct. It was, he thought, both admirable and melancholy. The digoxin, said Dorothea. Where did he get it? There are, in the present day, means of obtaining pharmaceutical substances that do not require a prescription, said Poirot. The blister pack I recovered from the kitchen bin was of European manufacture, consistent with an online purchase from Continental Pharmacy. Edmund had planned this for some time. The decision to attend the gathering was made before the invitation, I think. He had already prepared the means. He waited only for the opportunity. And Miriam? Said Dorothea softly. Did she know? I believe she suspected something was wrong. Not the specifics, not what Edmund planned. But she was afraid, as you observed. She is a perceptive woman who had been telling herself, for some time, that she was wrong in her suspicions. He paused. She chose, on the night, to tell herself that what she heard was nothing. But she could not, when asked directly, continue to maintain that. Miss Trant, who had returned with the tea and sat listening quietly, said, Mrs. Verford-Holt called me the best assistant she had ever had. Her voice was steady but effortful. I forgot to close the window. And she may have left it unlatched herself, said Poirot. We cannot know. What we know is that she was not passive in these events. She made choices. He looked at Miss Trant directly. The choice she made that was entirely clear was the choice of who to trust. She trusted you with the letters, with the notebook, 7 years of her private life. That trust was not misplaced. Miss Trant nodded very slightly and looked at her tea. Julian Faraday said, Will, the revised will, has no legal standing, said Poirot. It was never executed. The existing will is the operative document. Edmund Verford remains, or rather, will remain, until the legal consequences of his actions resolve. The named principal beneficiary, of course. He folded his hands. A person convicted of a crime against the testator cannot typically inherit under English law. Matter of what becomes of the estate will, I imagine, occupy Mr. Creel for some considerable time. Julian absorbed this. So the whole. He stopped. The whole plan, said Poirot, achieved nothing. The estate Edmund murdered to protect will now be distributed in ways entirely outside his control. It is, he added gently, generally the case. The crimes that seem most precisely calculated to secure a specific outcome are the ones most reliably undermined by their own execution. He paused. Murder is a blunt instrument. It solves, almost never, the problem it is applied to. Chapter 11. What the Rain Washed Clean. The Wednesday after Edmund Verford's arrest brought a clear morning to Ashbourne Hollow. The first genuinely clear day, Poirot's arrival. The sky above the Grange's pale stone was a pale, washed blue, and the garden, stripped and skeletal in late November, had the spare elegance of things that are not trying to be anything other than what they are. Poirot walked in the kitchen garden after breakfast. Albert Sims was turning soil again at the far end with the same meditative strokes. When Poirot came to stand near him, he looked up. "Finished, then," said Albert. "The principal matter, yes." Albert turned another shoveful. "What will happen to the house?" "That," said Poirot, "will be decided by people with more expertise in inheritance law than I possess." He paused. "I hope it is kept in good repair. It is a fine house." Albert considered this. "It's been holding its breath for years," he said finally. "Since the second Mr. Holt died and the money troubles started. A house knows, you know. When things aren't right." "Perhaps it does," said Poirot. He went back inside and found Dorothea Sable in the drawing-room, which was full of clean autumn light. She had set up her watercolour things on the window-seat. A small block of paper, a tin of paints, glass of water, and was looking out at the garden with the considering expression of a painter deciding what is worth recording. "Will you paint the house?" he asked. "I might," she said. "As it looks now, in the autumn light, before anything changes." She looked at him. "Monsieur Poirot." She knew she might die that night, didn't she? Truly knew it was possible. "I believe so," and she did it anyway. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. She was extraordinary. Infuriating and extraordinary. Her voice was even, but her eyes were bright. She could have simply told the police about Edmund's letters. "She could," said Poirot. "But I think she wanted, not the letters to speak. She wanted Edmund himself to speak, through his action. She had perhaps spent 60 years being believed wrong about something only to be proved right too late. She was not prepared for that to happen again." Dorothea nodded slowly. "Is that how you understand people? You think about what they needed to be true?" "I think," said Poirot, "about what each person in a given situation could not bear. That, more than any external fact, is the key to human behaviour. Edmund could not bear the loss of the estate. Miriam could not bear her own knowledge of her husband. Miss Trant could not bear to have been the one who left the window open. Your aunt, Madame Veriford Holt, could not bear to be dismissed, belittled, or merely outlived. And Julian," Poirot considered. "Julian Faraday could not bear, I think, to have misjudged her. He came here as a financial consultant and found himself outmanoeuvred by a woman of 81. He stayed because he was, despite himself, fascinated." He smiled faintly. "There are worse reasons to remain somewhere. Julia Faraday himself was leaving that afternoon. He came to find Poirot in the library before he went, hat in hand in the literal sense, with an expression of composed uncertainty. 'I want to understand something,' he said. 'Did she? Was the bequest to me? Was it genuine? Was she using me?' Poirot regarded him for a moment. 'I think,' he said carefully, 'that it was both, and that she may not have found that contradictory. She used you, yes, to provoke Edmund, to test his character, to demonstrate his greed. She was also, I believe, genuinely fond of you. She did not always separate those things neatly. He paused. She was human, Mr. Faraday. Even the very intelligent ones are, in the end. Faraday stood quietly for a moment. Then, she told me on Thursday at dinner that she had found in her long life that the people who surprised her most were the ones she initially discounted. He looked at Poirot. Think she counted me among those? I imagine, said Poirot, that she did. Faraday left. The Grange grew quieter. Chapter 12. The Mathematics of Grief. Miriam Veriford remained at Thornfield Grange for 2 days after her husband's arrest, in a state of self-contained composure that Poirot found both admirable and faintly heartbreaking. She made no dramatic scenes, issued no statements of loyalty or betrayal. She ate her meals, sat in the morning room with her books, and spoke when spoken to with the precise economy of a woman who has reduced her language to only what is necessary. On the Thursday, she came to find Poirot. He was in the library, reviewing his notes, a habit of the concluding stage of an investigation. The pattern had been established, and the act of reviewing it served to confirm that nothing had been missed. No thread left loose. Miriam sat across from him with her hands in her lap. She looked, he thought, very tired beneath the composure. "You were kind to me," she said, "when you asked about the corridor. You gave me a way to answer that didn't feel like." She stopped. "That didn't feel like condemnation, Poirot." "Yes." She paused. "I have been trying to understand since Tuesday whether I could have done something differently, whether there was a point at which I might have." "There was, perhaps, a point," said Poirot carefully. Pause. "When you might have spoken sooner about what you knew or suspected. But the understanding of one's own knowledge is not always immediate. We do not always perceive what we know until events make it undeniable." He folded his hands. "The responsibility for what happened belongs to the person who chose to act. You chose, in the end, to tell the truth. That choice is yours. Doesn't feel very heroic." "Most true things don't," said Poirot. "That is what distinguishes them from the other kind." She looked at him with her intelligent grey eyes. "He said, afterward, when the police came, that he had only meant to frighten her, to give her the substance in such a small quantity that it would only sicken her, make her ill enough to call the whole thing off, not revise the will, that he hadn't meant to." She stopped. "Did you believe him?" said Poirot. A long pause. "I don't know," said Miriam Veriford at last. "I genuinely do not know, and I think that is the most terrible part." She stood. "Whether it's true or not, whether he meant it or not, she is still dead." "Yes," said Poirot, "she is." After Miriam left, he sat for a while in the quiet library. Edmund's claim of a lesser intent was, he thought, quite possibly true in the narrow technical sense that Edmund had administered what he believed to be a sublethal dose. It was also, in any meaningful sense, entirely irrelevant. One does not doctor an old woman's water glass with a cardiac substance and retain credible claim to benign intention. The law would settle the precise question. The moral reality needed no further settlement. He had seen the years of his career. Many people who had committed terrible acts through the progressive narrowing of their moral vision, the incremental convincing of themselves that one small further step was permissible, reasonable, even necessary. Edmund Veriford had not woken one morning as a murderer. He had arrived there through the accumulated logic of a man who felt wronged, entitled desperate, and who had, at each junction, chosen the self-justifying path. The result was identical to premeditated malice. The psychology was slightly different. It was, if anything, more common. On Thursday evening, the last of the formal obligations concluded. Inspector Graves came to the house to confirm the charges and the removal of relevant evidence. He shook Poirot's hand with the sincere warmth of a man who has had his investigation resolved for him, and has arrived at sufficient professional grace to be grateful rather than resentful. "Extraordinary business," said Graves. "Less extraordinary than it appears," said Poirot. "The human heart is finite in its repertoire. Greed, fear, love, pride. These are not new instruments. They produce new music, but they are the same instruments." "Philosophically put," said Graves. "I am occasionally philosophical," said Poirot. "In small doses, like certain medicines, philosophy in excess is toxic." Graves laughed, briefly, and then, as though remembering where he was, stopped. Chapter 13. The Empty Rooms. The Empty Rooms by Friday, 1 week after the death, Thornfield Grange had shed most of its inhabitants. Miriam Verriford had left for London to be met by a solicitor, and to begin the process of understanding what her life now looked like from its new vantage point. Julian Faraday was gone. Inspector Graves had collected the last of the evidence, and closed the house's formal role as a scene of inquiry. Sergeant Elford had, in his departure, shaken everyone's hand with the quiet respect of a man who has been changed, slightly, by something he has witnessed. Only Dorothea and Miss Trant remained, and Poirot, who was not yet ready to leave. He walked the house on the Friday morning with the particular attention of farewell, because he was not a man who left places carelessly. He walked the upper corridor and stood outside the door to Mrs. Verriford Holt's room, which remained closed, for the moment, by informal agreement between the two women. He walked the library, the morning room, kitchen, where Phoebe Trant had been managing herself with industry. He walked the garden, the rose walk, and the stone bench with its view to the ivy wall. He thought about Constance Verriford Holt. He had not in this case met the victim, paused. It was one of the unusual features of the matter. He had known her only through the impressions of others, the entries in her notebook, the contents of her letters, the physical evidence of her habits and tastes. And yet he felt, with some confidence, he had come to understand her. She had been a woman of great capability and great loneliness. The first marriage had been, by all accounts, practical rather than warm. The second warmer, and therefore the more painful when it ended. The family she had gathered around her, Edmund, Dorothea, in their different ways, had loved or resented or needed her, but had not perhaps seen her clearly. Miss Trant had been closest to seeing her clearly, he thought. But their relationship was circumscribed by its professional nature. Julian Faraday had come to her orbit by accident and remained, perhaps, because she was the most interesting person he had encountered in years. She had known it and used it, and also, he was fairly certain, valued it. It was a lonely kind of life, he thought, to be always the most intelligent person in the room, to have outlived the people who could match you, to find that the remaining company was composed largely of those who wanted something from you. It explained, perhaps, why she had chosen to arrange things so precisely in her final act, to go not as a passive victim, but as the author of a revelation. Not sure he approved. The danger she had placed herself in, the risk, it could so easily have been concealed. If Dorothea had not been awake, Albert Sims had not been looking out his window, if Miriam had not, in the end, found the honesty to speak, much might have been lost. Constance Verriford Holt had bet on being found out, and she had been fortunate. It was, Poirot reflected, not a strategy he would have recommended, and yet, here he paused, standing by the stone bench in the November cold. He understood it. There was a kind of courage in it, not the courage he admired most, which was quieter and less theatrical, but courage nevertheless. She had, in her final hours, done what she had spent 80 years doing. She had arranged things precisely as she intended them, and had trusted that the truth, once planted, grow. It had grown. He heard the gate of the kitchen garden open and turned. Dorothea came along the rose walk in her coat, the small canvas tucked under her arm, the watercolour she had been working on for 2 days. "Going?" she said. "Soon," said Poirot. "After lunch, think. I must return to London." She handed him the canvas. It was a study of the Grange from the garden, the pale stone, the ivy wall, tall windows, rendered in the clear, somewhat stark light of November. She had painted it well. The beauty of the architecture was present, but so was the unchecked ivy, the slightly melancholy quality of a house in suspension. "I thought you might like it," she said. "Something to remember us by." "You are very kind, Mademoiselle Sable." He looked at the painting. "You have caught it accurately. The beauty and thee held breath." "I noticed that about it the moment I arrived," she said. "I thought it was just the old lady and her difficult family. I didn't realise it was." "Fear," said Poirot. "Yes, a house where someone is afraid takes on that quality. It enters the walls." "Will Miss Trant be all right?" said Dorothea. "Miss Trant," said Poirot, "is considerably stronger than she appears. She will grieve. She is grieving, but she will also manage. She always has." He paused. "She has the cottage, the annuity. She has Albert Sims, who has worked here 22 years and is not going anywhere. She has the task of managing the estate's affairs until the legal situation resolves." He looked at her. "She has you, I imagine, when you choose to visit." Dorothea looked at the house. "Often," she said quietly. "I'll visit often." They stood for a moment in the spare November garden, the house behind them, and the pale sky above, the whole complicated truth of the past week settling around them like the season itself. Bare and clear, and in its own way resolved. Chapter 14. The little grey cells take their leave. The hired motor car came at 3 o'clock. Poirot came downstairs to find both Dorothea and Phoebe Trant in the entrance hall. He was dressed for travel, his black coat, his hat, his gloves, each item in its correct place. His bag had been carried down by Albert Sims, who had then, characteristically, returned to the garden without ceremony. Phoebe Trant shook his hand. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple and exact. "You did a great deal of it yourself," said Poirot. "The letters, the notebook, your own courage in speaking when the moment came. These were not small things." She nodded. There was a quality in her face now that had not been there at the beginning of the week. Not relief, exactly, but the particular settled composure that comes after grief has been named and accepted. She would carry this, he thought. She was the kind of person who carried things, but she would carry it upright. Dorothea walked him to the car. The gravel crunched under their feet in the cold afternoon silence. She had her coat on and her hands in her pockets. She looked at him sideways with the directness he had come to expect from her. "Tell me one thing honestly," she said. "I generally try to be honest. Did you know it was Edmund from the very beginning? Before all the interviews, before the letters, did you know?" Poirot considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. He placed his bag in the motor car and turned to face her. "No," he said. "I had, from the beginning, a direction. The water glass told me it was someone who had access to the bedroom. Either direct access through the door or indirect access through the window. The immediate assumption of the police was that the access was through the door, that therefore the killer was one of the 5 household members who could have walked the corridor. This was correct, but incomplete, because of the window. Because of the window, yes. Which gave me a different set of questions, not who had access to the corridor but who knew. Window was unlatched and could manage the wall. These were smaller circles within the larger one. When I then considered motive, the will, The letters, the financial history tree, the circles narrowed further. He paused. The thread on the ivy confirmed what I already thought probable. Miriam's account of the corridor made it certain. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. But you let everyone speak before you said anything. Always, said Poirot. One does not spend the interview confirming what one already believes. One listens for the thing one has not yet imagined, in this case. He hesitated. The thing I had not yet fully understood, when I arrived, was the old woman herself. Why she had arranged things so, what she had intended. That took longer. He looked at the house. She was, I think, the most interesting person in this case. She would have liked to hear you say that, said Dorothea. Her voice was warm and a little uneven. I expect, said Poirot, she would have told me I was late in noticing it. Dorothea laughed, a genuine, unprepared sound that rose into the cold air and then was gone. Poirot opened the car door, then stopped. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the small folded handkerchief in which, since Monday, he had been carrying the blister pack from the kitchen bin. He handed it to Dorothea. For Inspector Graves, he said. He has, I believe, already identified the source, but this may be useful for the prosecution establishing prior planning. He paused. Also in my pocket, wrapped separately, the thread from the ivy wall. He will want that too. Dorothea took both items carefully. Been carrying the evidence all week. A small inconvenience, said Poirot. One must keep one's pockets organised. He got into the motor car. Driver, who had been waiting with the resigned patience of a man who has been hired by the hour, started the engine. Dorothea stood on the gravel and raised a hand in farewell. As the car turned and began the long drive down toward the village, Poirot did not look back at the house. He looked instead at the watercolour canvas, which he had placed carefully on the seat beside him, the pale stone, the ivy wall, the windows that had seen so much and shown so little. Dorothea had caught something in it that he thought was true. The beauty that persists through the difficult, the structure that endures despite those who inhabit it. He thought, as he so often did in these concluding journeys, about the particular strangeness of what he did. He arrived at places where something terrible had happened. He spoke to frightened, guilty, grieving, lying people. He assembled the fragments of a truth that someone had worked very hard to obscure. And then he left, and the people stayed, and the house stood, and whatever consequences followed. The legal ones, the personal ones, the long, slow ones of changed relationships and reorganized lives. These were not his to witness. He solved the problem. The problem, once solved, was no longer his. It was, he thought, the correct arrangement. He was a man of method, of precision, careful application of intelligence to disorder. He was not, had never been, a shepherd. He could not stay and tend the aftermath. That required different qualities. Dorothea's directness, Miss Trant's competence, Albert Simms's endurance. He had none of these. What he had used. The motor car reached the village high street. The bakery was closed at this hour, its windows dark. The crowned stag was lit warmly, its sign swinging in the slight wind. A woman walked a dog along the pavement with the unhurried air of someone for whom the past week had been entirely ordinary. Ashbourne Hollow resumed, as small places always do, its ordinary life around the extraordinary thing that had briefly occurred within it. Poirot settled his hat, smoothed his gloves, and folded his hands in his lap. The case of Thornfield Grange, he said to himself, concluded. The little grey cells, having done their work, rested. Outside, the low November sky was beginning, as he watched it, to lighten, a pale gold at the very edge of the horizon, the last of the afternoon sun making one final effort before dark. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then it was gone, and the sky went to silver, and the motor car carried Hercule Poirot quietly away from Ashbourne Hollow and toward London and toward whatever came next. End.